Chapter 5, Bebop. From here forward in the book, you're going to see jazz fragment. It's going to shoot off in a ton of different directions, and this is really where we see it start. The swing era is still active as this new style is evolving in the early to mid 1940s. It's mostly happening at underground clubs, places like this one right here, Minton's Playhouse, with the great Thelonious Monk as the house pianist there, and you'll read all about him. At the top of the chapter, just like others, you have a discussion of techniques, how bebop gets started, and then you have two very interesting articles. The first one is called Bop is Nowhere by Leon Wolf. This appeared in a magazine of the day. And then you have a much longer excerpt from a book by the great Dizzy Gillespie. We'll talk about in great detail in this chapter. It's called The Cult of Bebop, and he does an 11-point discussion of why bebop is valid and why it's an important art form and why people are getting it wrong. This is a long article. It is absolutely worth the trouble. It's kind of stream of consciousness. He digresses into all kind of stories, and the stories are actually really interesting. But it does go on and on, so you got to read it with a little care. Be diligent. It's absolutely worth the trouble. I love this. Got this at the Institute of Jazz Studies. This is a little cartoon advertisement for a music instrument company that Dizzy played Martin Instruments for a while, and this is it's a very fake story, but it's kind of interesting. This is kind of cool. And you've got other ad copy as you go through, some just interesting things to look at. Dizzy did the first official State Department tour in 1956, and here's a picture from that and some articles about that as well. It's kind of hip. And then we get into the people who made it happen. Art Tatum, the great improviser Art Tatum. You have a beautiful track called Willow Weep for Me. There's a Bill Gottlieb photograph of Art out in front of a club that he was working at. And then we get into the big three: Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk. Now, they worked together, they worked separately. I'll stop at this picture here as well. We're not going to talk about him a lot here in Chapter 5, but a very young Miles Davis gets his start playing with Charlie Parker. You're going to meet Miles in Chapter 6. He's critical to the evolution of cool school music. You'll see him again in Chapter 7 with hard bop, and you'll see him again as a pioneer of fusion music in Chapter 9. Right here is where he gets his start. It's pretty cool. Charlie Parker with Strings, absolutely beautiful album. Listen to that with care. Got a nice picture of it as well, just kind of hip. There's Dizzy Gillespie with his trumpet and his cheeks. Nothing to say there. Dizzy had a bad embouchure. He actually didn't. His embouchure was actually pretty good, but he poked out his cheeks, which we teach all brass students not to do. He did it anyway. Just sort of have to deal with it. It's what he looks like. Dizzy fronted a big band playing bebop, which is kind of hip and different. Got a lot of good active links again. Monk is the iconoclast of the group, more interested in composition. One other photograph I'll point out is this one. This was one night. Bob Parent happened to be at the club this night. Here's Monk, Charlie Parker, of course, young Roy Hayes playing drum, but this guy right here, Charles Mingus. Mingus played with Louis Armstrong a bit. He played with Duke Ellington a bit. He's a pioneer in this bebop style. He passes through Chapter 6 Cool School, and most importantly, you'll meet him and spend some time with him in Chapter 7. He cuts a wide swath through jazz. There's the first picture you get to see of him. After Monk, I do sort of a laundry list. Bud Powell, great piano player, and this is just an absolute tiny catch-all. Look at every one of these names. Trust me, you all have Spotify as you're doing this class. You can plug any one of these names in and come up with literally hundreds and hundreds of truly world-class recordings. So this is just kind of a catch-all of other people who are pioneering bebop. And then we talk a little bit about singing. I mentioned Ella in Chapter 4. Here's Ella again in Chapter 5 with Dizzy Gillespie. She modernizes her style and begins to scat sing like these guys were playing their horns. Then we get something even more different. This guy, Eddie Jefferson, and another guy named King Pleasure, pioneer something new and different called vocalese. Vocalese, and you'll see it spelled a lot of different ways. ESE, ESSE, ISE. No matter how you spell it, it's adding a word or a syllable for every note of bebop recordings. They would listen to these recordings and they would make these incredible records singing the stuff. Then this group came along and they started doing it in harmony. So they did a lot of bebop, modern jazz type stuff, but they also could reach back into the swing era canon and pull up things like Cottontail from Duke Ellington and great tunes from Count Basie and imitate the Basie band. As I'm recording this in July 2020, we just lost Annie Ross. She just passed away a couple of weeks ago. Very tragic. So there you go. There's some really cool singing. And again, you've got Spotify. You've got one track here. There's 15 albums of these guys. If you like this kind of singing, it's pretty cool. So there you go. A little more focused chapter than what you saw before. And of course, again, the discussion of bebop today because the music continues. More in chapter 6.